In the United States, elections are coming up, and there has been a lot of talk about the integrity of the vote and the integrity of our elections. And there seems to be a lot of talk about how our democracy is in danger. And by the way, it is. But there's a lot of talk about problems, and I don't often see a ton of talk about solutions. So I wanted to take some time to talk about the United States, how to fix the United States' democracy, and then how we go about fixing democracy in general. And actually, I'm going to start with how we fix democracies in general and how we maintain democracies in general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the particulars of the US. And I think this is important because it's all well and dandy to point out issues, and there are plenty of issues, and I do appreciate the work that people do in pointing those issues out. But we also need to talk solutions and ways that these solutions can be effectuated so that we're not kind of rhetorically doom scrolling, as it were, and causing people to feel abandoned by the system, to check out of the system, and what have you. So, in general, the way you maintain a democracy is you expand the right to vote, right? You give suffrage to more and more people until everyone is able to vote, right? So, and by the way, there are obviously appropriate restrictions on voting. You know, you might want an age restriction on voting to make sure that people who don't have fully developed minds yet aren't casting ballots. You may want to have, you know, geographic restrictions on voting. You know, obviously, if you're having an election in Georgia, you don't want someone from California being able to cast a ballot, right? You know, there are reasonable limits to democracy. But generally speaking, in order for democracy to continue to function well, you must constantly expand who can vote. You must constantly be trying as much as possible to either make voting easier or to make sure that more people can vote or to make sure that voting percentages are higher. Because if you don't do that and you get to a place where there are constant efforts to disenfranchise people, to remove groups who should be allowed to vote from a logical perspective from the actual pool of voters, you start to have distrust in the system. And because democracies are so fragile, and I've talked about that in a previous video, if there is sufficient doubt in the system and its ability to reflect the will of the people and provide representation of those people, then the people will start to turn towards other forms of government that are less democratic, right? And if democracy is the goal, which for many democracies it is, right, to continue functioning as a democracy, then you have to make sure that you continue to make it easier to vote, more that voting, and you have to continually prove, by the way, that voting actually accomplishes something, because that's one more way that doubt can get in. Okay, so generally speaking, that's how, you know, that's kind of the basics. But what does that look like, practically speaking? So if you are looking for ways to expand the franchise, one of the things that you can do is just make sure it's easier for people to vote. So whether that is mail-in voting, or if are multiple voting stations in every precinct, or, you know, you have people who go around and collect ballots when they're filled out, whatever it is, finding a mechanism where it becomes easier for people to actually do the act of voting. Oh, another big one is make Election Day a holiday, or have voting on weekends, or have multiple days of voting, right? All of these things make it easier for people to vote. So that's the first big category of things to continue to expand democracy. And the second is to make the process of getting ready to vote easier. So this can be things having to do with the amount of information that people can get. So required airtime on national broadcasts. You can do the fairness doctrine had something about this, right? Where you'd have to have different candidates on, opposing candidates on, to give their point of views. You couldn't just take one. And there are flaws with that system, but I don't want to really go into it right now. I'm just kind of talking about these solutions, in a broad sense. You can make you can get rid of registration to vote, right? You can just say, hey, if you turn 18 in this country, you live here, you turn 18, the government just sends you a voting card and said, hey, you have a voting card, from now on you can vote, right? And here's your, given where you live, this is where you should vote. And these are the candidates who are available to you, right? Making sure that people know about the candidates, making sure that people have don't have to put in extra resources, right? Because one of the things that's difficult, and one of the reasons that we see that people don't vote, is because voting can be expensive, which is to say that if you have to put in resources to vote, you are less likely to vote, right? Now, mind you, there are still very motivated people who, despite the need to expend resources, whether tangible or intangible, to cast a ballot, still find a way to do so. But we can make it easier for them to do so, and there's no need for it to be so complicated. So the result would be that that access to the ballot is that access to voting is expanded. Another thing that some countries done to maintain democracy have been to institute mandatory voting. Now, this has its own problems, and I am going to talk about these for a second. Obviously, mandatory voting makes it so that it is literally required by law to vote. If you don't vote, you receive a fine. Now, in a lot of places, the fine isn't particularly large, but it still is a fine. And some people who want to vote but can't might still get fined. There are problems there. But the fines also can be levied higher. Obviously, a fine just is a punishment that essentially allows the rich to get away with while the poor suffer. Lots of things wrong with fining people for that, but it does tend to raise the percentage of the population that participates in ballots, that participates in elections, because they literally don't have a choice. I actually don't think this is a great method, but it is a method you can use to get more people elected. To get more people elected, my apologies. To get more people participating in democracy, right? So all of these are general strategies that can be used to ensure that people have an easier time voting. Another way you can expand democracy is to switch from a first past the post system to or single member districts. And essentially what that means is you vote for one person to fill one seat. And you can transfer to multi-member districts or to proportional representation system. So proportional representation is an electoral system where you vote for a slate of candidates, typically ones that are given by a party, and then everyone who passes a certain threshold for votes gets access to governance. So oftentimes this happens in national elections where everyone votes for parties, and every party that gets above 5% gets a certain number of seats based on their allocation, right? And everyone below 5% gets knocked out. But for the most part, it does allow for more diversity in the groups of people that end up being elected, because there are just more opportunities for you to be part of a smaller party and get in, okay? And a lot of countries have this. It's a generally great system. But moving in that direction, allowing more people to occupy more seats, not only does it make voting, not only does it help with democracy because there's just more diversity and representation, it also allows more people to actually try and get elected in the first place, because they've got a better chance to actually be involved and to become a candidate, because the threshold for access to power is much lower, right? So this also expands democracy. So generally speaking, those are strategies that can be used to improve democracies. Now, I want to change gears here and move towards American democracy. So there are lots of problems with American democracy. I think the preeminent of which is money in politics. I think the first And most obvious solution is to ban money in politics, to ban stock trades by all members of government at all levels, to make sure that our people in government are well compensated so that they don't feel as if they have to go and shill for other interests in order to, do well for themselves. I'm not opposed to people in government doing well. I mean, I don't think they should be making like CEO money, but I do think they should be, able to do well. They should be able to create retirement, right? Like they should have good livings, right? Because we trust them with a huge responsibility. So we want to reward them for taking that responsibility on. And by the way, for being pure in doing it, only eliciting donations from individual donors or very small groups, and making sure that if they go through the process, they do it the right way. They're actually someone who's connected to the ground, to the area at which they're from, that they should be rewarded with a good salary, the ability to get some benefit out of it. Now, true, it's their public servant, right? And the point is to make some sacrifices, but I think we can limit the number of sacrifices that they make, right? So, for example, I would rather have them working really long hours as opposed to, being on call time with donors for 5 hours a day, right? Which is a thing that Congress does. So I think that's one way to improve our democracy. I also think that we need to find a way to increase on a legitimate level the number of parties that can participate in this system. Now, our system is pretty much enshrined in the Constitution. That leads to two parties. Two parties are not enshrined in the Constitution, but we have what's called a first past the post system, a majoritarian system, and we have a system where the district magnitude for most positions is one, which is to say that you vote for one candidate to get one seat. If we move to a proportional representation system, we are much less likely to have this issue, and we get to a place where it is more likely that there is more diverse opinions, and it's harder to be as partisan in that sense because it's not an either or, right? There are other options, and if one of the parties if one of the major parties isn't delivering well for their constituents, then the constituent has the option to go and find another party, a legitimate and viable party, to cast their vote in, and thus to punish the party that would have gotten elected for not doing what it should have done, right? So that would be another way to improve American democracy. The other thing that really we need to do is we need to stop fucking around with who can vote. Honestly, in my opinion, and I get people who disagree with me, if you are present in this country, if you are present in a jurisdiction when there's election and you have been present there for 6 or 7 months, you should be able to vote there. And the reason for that is because at that point, the actions of government alter your life in a significant enough way that if we really believe in representation of the people for whom government works, but also manages and legislates against, then we need to make sure that those people have a say in what the government looks like. If not, we kind of get to the taxation without representation thing again, and not literally, right, but we have people who are existing in a system where the government is taking actions for and to them, but they don't get a say in how that government is shaped, right? So I think, generally speaking, expand the franchise as much as possible. If you're present in an area for, maybe you can even do 7 or 8 months before an election, you can vote in that election. Honestly, I think we should have automatic voter registration. As soon as you turn 18, you should just have the ability to vote. I also think universal mail-in ballots would be great. The Postal Service is an amazing gift that we have in this country. It is the only department, is the only major bureaucracy of the federal government that we outline in the Constitution for Congress's right to implement it. It's, other than the military, it is its ability to deliver mail is pretty much unparalleled almost anywhere in the world. I believe at last check, the United States Postal Service delivered over 40% of the world's mail and did it pretty damn well, despite the fact that there are politicians in this country who are trying to dismantle that service. But while the service is still around and we are not relying on private couriers for all our letters and packages and things, it is extremely important that we use that to give more people access to the ballot. It's very difficult for people, especially because Election Day is not a holiday in the U.S. By the way, it should be. We should have multiple days off to vote. But even if that was the case, you would still find people who are not able to physically get to a polling booth, whether because they are differently abled or because they have work or some other reason they can't go. So the solution is to allow anyone who wants to post a ballot. And by the way, one of the interesting things that we can do to improve American democracy, and this is related, I promise, I will go back, is we need to stop setting the expectation that we will find out the result of an election the night of the election. It doesn't make any sense. There is so much that needs to be done in order to ensure that an election has been conducted appropriately, that the ballots are counted appropriately and safely, to make sure that the candidates are each apprised of their rights when it comes to their rights when it comes to challenging and challenging results of all those things cannot happen in one day. They simply can't. And it is, especially in a country so large, it is that we expect our election start making it a cultural point. And everyone who talks about elections, I think, should make this point. We should not reasonably expect for elections to be decided for a week after we go to the polls. And I know it's frustrating, and the media, who only loves to cover the horse race, will be upset with that. But the truth is, you can wait. It's not going to end your world if you don't find out that night. And no matter who the candidates are, so it's important that we start to set the expectation now, especially if we're going to transfer to a system where more people have access to the ballot over a longer period of time, that voting results should take a week, and that should be normal. Now, if they start to take too long, sure, people can get antsy, and that's fine. But I think a week is perfectly reasonable, and that way we have taken this mad dash politics that we engage in the United States and slowed it down a bit. And by the way, this could be good for the media too, right? Because they'll still have their horse race, and actually they get an extra week of horse race, right? Because numbers, I'm sure, will be reported in periodically, and they can look at who's jockeying for positions or whatever, and how negotiations are going or what have you. The media can still win in all of this, okay? But for us as people, as regular people who aren't necessarily in tune to the media all the time, it's important for us to temper those expectations, because when we temper those expectations and we are comfortable with an election taking a while to count up, we actually make it possible for more people, for system changes to occur where more people are allowed to be a part of democracy, okay? Which is super important. Going back to other ways we can increase access, we need to take a look at how our civil rights are written out, right? There has been far too long where people have been discriminated against in ways that are genuinely unfair. As I said before, voting should be super easy. It should be something that you can do without thinking. Now, you shouldn't do it without thinking, obviously, right? You should consider who you're voting for. You should make, intentional decisions. You should vote strategically if you have to. All of that should be, people should take voting seriously, because it is a serious thing. And if we are able to reform our system, it can actually change the way that we live and go about, our daily lives. But if we make it harder for people to vote, then we get back to that situation that I mentioned earlier where there's not confidence in the system. Other ways that American democracy can be improved: and gerrymandering, right? Make sure that all drawing of districts is done by independent commissions. By the way, if you move to a multi-member system, the districts have to be much larger to account for the fact that multiple people will be elected from them. You can help with the problem of gerrymandering by switching to a multi-member system. So I think it's really important that all of these things are taken into account, but obviously the largest one, especially in the US context, is other than just direct voting rights, of course, is money in politics, because that is the largest indicator that elections don't matter. And unfortunately, for the most part, elections don't matter, regardless of who you put in. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, right? There have been very few exceptions to that, but not a lot of policy has been passed in the past 40 or 50 years that genuinely helps regular people. So obviously, I think that's the biggest challenge of all. But once you drill past that, I hopefully, I've laid out a bunch of ways that you can actually make the system more democratic. Oh, and abolish the Senate. Just get rid of the whole thing. It's useless. Just have one house. Just have the House of Representatives, essentially doing it that way. You don't need a second house. It's pretty useless. It doesn't do much. It honestly, where good things go to die. Just make the House of Representatives so much bigger. And by the way, according to some political science theories, the United States House of Representatives should be close to like 700 members. So we are way under par. We are very underrepresented in the country. So anyway, there are lots of ways that we can improve American democracy. I hope that this has been a little bit of a primer on how we can fix democracy here in the US and abroad.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.